is our third and final session, third and final panel for the day. However, the topic is probably one of the most talked about talked about topic right now. It's buzzing in the social media, and the topic, of course, is the Me Too India. And we will, our panelists will actually discuss whether a Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act stands as test in this particular Me Too India movement. Now, to provide their valuable insights, we have a full house of panelists, and please, join me in welcoming the moderator of this particular panel, and please welcome Mr. Ramanand Mundkur. He is the managing partner of the Mundkur Law Partners. Please also join me in welcoming Ms. Sunita Parikh on stage. She is an Assistant General Counsel for APAC and India region for Subex India Limited. Please also join me in welcoming Ms. Tapasya Rao. She is the Head of Health, Safety and Environment for Nordex India Private Limited. Please welcome Ms. Shweta Pandey on the stage. She's the Director Legal of Target India. And also please join me in welcoming Ms. Nirmala Menon on stage. She's the founder and CEO of Interweave Consulting Private Limited. I would request the moderator to take it over and start the session.
Thank you, Indranil. This is a very attractive position to be in, talking about sexual harassment surrounded by women. And if there's one thing living in a house full of women has taught me, it's the only route for a man to survive in that environment is by saying less. So on that note, I'd like to get this panel going, talking about an issue that seems to be in the papers every single day. And there are a couple of issues to keep in mind out here, which is the first word in the Sexual Harassment Act is the word prevention. And to my mind, when the question is asked whether the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act stands the test, clearly the Me Too movement has demonstrated, at least in terms of, if based on press reports, that it doesn't stand the test. A more worrying fact, and there are a couple of more worrying facts that come out of this, is there was a recent report in the Economic Times that even with Me Too, about 80% of known instances are not being reported. So even though we are talking about how wide the coverage is with Me Too in India, the fact is that we still don't know the bulk of what's happening in companies. And there was another aspect that also came out of Me Too, not in India, but in the US. There was a recent report in the Harvard Business Review about how Me Too is actually now turning around and affecting the hiring prospects for women, particularly in the finance industry. And that seems to be a double whammy. So it's creating a situation where women who are being disadvantaged don't talk about it. And then the women who talk about it make it harder for people just to get a job. And in that context, I think, before I say any more, I'd like to start with maybe Tapasya on the base question. Is there sufficient awareness about Bosch, does there need to be more focus on creating awareness, on training, on issues like that? And in that respect, does the POSH Act do enough?
Thank you, Raman. It's on? No, it's on. So awareness is a very, very interesting topic to start with. And when we speak about awareness on POSH, the POSH Act as such asks us to give awareness to the employees and to tell that, okay, the employees need to be aware what are their rights, what they can go for and stuff like that. So currently, if we look at the awareness sessions which are happening in the corporates or MNCs, yes, there are awareness sessions which are happening. You have regular trainings which are given. There are workshops happening. There might be some questionnaires which are being circulated to see if people are aware on exactly what the POSH is and stuff like that. But that is not the only sector where women are. We have to see in a manufacturing setup, for example, you have employees working in the shop floor. You have housekeeping staff. You have security staff. When we speak to these people, whether they are trained, because they are normally not on-roll employees, they are normally contract staff. So there are no obligations on the contractor to deliver these trainings. And that is one sector, and this is all organized, and you do have the unorganized sector, where you have daily wages laborers, weekly wage laborers who are coming in. And that is one area where I don't think there's any training. This is my personal opinion, because when I go to a shop floor, be it in our own company or the companies where we are getting components from, and when we speak to somebody on POSH and they're like, do we have something like that? So, and the ladies are actually really hesitant to discuss about this topic. That is one more reason maybe why this topic is not being discussed. So these are the few things. Yes, there are trainings which are being given. Maybe it happens once in a year or once in 2 years, but we can improve on that.
Right, thanks. So actually, that sort of leads into the issue of whether the POSH Act is too straitjacketed. And Sunita, I'll ask you to speak to this. Does it take a one-size-fits-all approach? And just to place it in context, that same accusation has also been made about the Me Too movement, that it telescopes all forms of sexual harassment. It treats sexual assault with the same level of distinction as an offensive email. And the question is, in taking this sort of straitjacketed approach, is there something wrong with the way we're dealing with sexual harassment in not just in terms of both what the law says, but how we are responding to its occurrence?
Yeah. So thanks, Ramanand. I think you have given me a hint in your question. The law cannot cover all the instances. It can never cover, it cannot foresee all the instances. It is pretty much broad. In my opinion, it is pretty much broad. Taking straitjacket approach is something which is up to the management of the organization and up to the maturity of the ICC, I would say. So in my experience, I wouldn't say that the ICC, a matured ICC, is always taking a similar approach in all kind of incidences. So I know about certain incidents, a very real scenario where there was a liftman who used to operate the lift of an organization, and there was a housekeeping female employee who was using this lift, and they were speaking to each other in the lift. They were friendly to each other. They were talking to each other in the lift, and the liftman while talking to her, turned her ID card outwards, showing the details of that female employee, the face and the details of the female employee, which the female employee took as a sexual harassment. When The ICC called up the meeting and called up the liftman. He did agree to the facts. He said, I did that. He said, I didn't know it's a sexual harassment. We are pretty friendly. And in the context of the case, the action which was taken against the liftman was not as severe as to maybe terminate the employee. So I would say that this is ensuring that it is taken up with in a more matured way within the reading the context. How do you go about the particular incidents? That is more upon the ICC, not upon the statute.
So if I understand you correctly, I think what you're saying is it's really then up to us to bring that differentiation, to stop trying to use the law as a one-size-fits-all.
Yes. And
does the law allow that flexibility?
Law doesn't really determine what is the punishment you are going to give.
That's true.
You do not. Law doesn't really say so. It does allow the flexibility. I believe.
Great. But okay, and one of the other things you talked about actually brings up a couple of other issues, and I'd like to get Shweta and Nirmala involved in. So Shweta, actually, Nirmala, starting with you, because I think, just taking from Sunita's point about the liftman saying, I didn't know it was sexual harassment. In a lot of situations there, the committee is faced with a he said, she said dilemma. And the committee then has to effectively make a call on what is and what isn't sexual harassment in terms of getting facts, in terms of getting evidence. And there's an underlying question about culture, and I'll come to that, to you on that, Shweta. But do you think that committees today have sufficient tools to make a fair assessment of the facts, given the wide variety of situations that give rise to posh complaints, and to deal with all of the other related issues to come to a conclusion on this?
Thank you. And in terms of tools, I don't think there's a whole lot of guidance that the law gives. There is a lot that is made up as we go along. And what I see with committees is that, you're expected to play the role of a reasonable person, and in some cases a reasonable woman, in terms of how you look at the case. So this particular thing that she was talking about, the liftman and you will look at the circumstances, how friendly were they, and maybe it doesn't qualify as sexual harassment. She was offended by it, but by kind of treating that as sexual harassment, a handshake in the office or somebody saying you're looking good today, meant well, could also qualify, right? So it's always the circumstances that you look at. In what context did something happen? Is there a history before it? A one-off comment like that usually does not qualify. So you are reasonable, and the law gives you a whole bunch of varied punishments, starting from counseling to termination. So you can use any of those depending on the gravity of the offense that actually happened. So it is definitely not a one-size-fits-all. But education, I think, is the most important. I think even today, people tend to think sexual harassment is something physical. So helping people to understand the very nuanced, layered, and very subtle behaviors that tend to happen in organizations. A dirty joke, like you said, and many times people say, hey, I thought I was in good company, I was just cracking a joke. So being aware, being mindful, and I see in the work that we do over the last several years that it's actually moving now. So far we were talking about behaviors. Now we have come to a point where we are starting to talk about consent. What is consent? Right? That's a subtler form of a relationship, because you're seeing so many cases where the person says, this happened and she didn't protest. I put my hand around her, she didn't say anything. So I thought that was permission for me to go ahead. Stuff like this needs to be conveyed, every now and then until it becomes a culture of the organization. So there's a lot of work ahead of us.
Absolutely. And that last bit that you said about becoming the culture of the organization, I think that presents an issue right up front the moment you get a complaint. How does an organization respond to a complaint on day one? Because the first thing that the person receiving the complaint is often hit with is the struggle between the human relationships that you have as co-workers and the facts of the complaint, which might be horrific, might be pretty scandalous. So as an organization, what do you do in responding to complaints, and how do you balance the relationship aspect with the legal mandates of the law? And it goes to another point you were making, Nirmala, which is, while you have a range of sanctions, how do you deal with relationships until you get to a determination of whether or not sexual harassment did or did not occur? Because clearly there are relationship tensions within the organization. So what have been your experiences in dealing with those issues, Shweta, and what do you think are the appropriate responses to that situation?
So first of all, I'd like to take a couple of steps back, Ramanand, and go back to what you were asking initially as to whether the statute is A, robust enough, and B, offers flexibility. And this is tied very closely to the question that you're actually posing to me. In my opinion, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, the 2013 legislation, is a really well-rounded piece of legislation in the Indian scenario. And why I say that is that it deeply empowers an organization to kind of have the right mechanisms in place to spread awareness on the issue, and when issues are reported, to deal with them in the best possible manner. And that is where the will of an enterprise really takes over, that here's a piece of legislation which probably in the legislative history of this country is really well thought of, is deeply rooted into what the Supreme Court propounded in the Vishakha case, and has actually been around for a good number of years now for companies to start organizations, and not just, I wouldn't say just corporations, for any formal workplace to now start thinking about how does it want to really implement. So it kind of goes really deep into the will of the organization and how it wants to leverage this wonderful piece of statute, because right from giving powers to the internal committees as civil courts, to taking it to a point where if you don't feel comfortable enough in a he said, she said situation where you think that you don't have ample evidence to really take any action against the respondent, you can actually turn it over to the law enforcement. So I think it contemplates a very, very wide spectrum, and if companies have the right culture, right level of awareness, basis their will, they can really leverage this piece of law to their advantage to empower their women workforce. And why just women workforce? I mean, there are corporations who have made this gender agnostic, so it provides much greater protection to the larger workforce to leverage it as they think appropriate.
Okay, but I agree with you, but I think there are some questions that throws up. So if this is a good statute, and I'm not saying it's not, why then has it taken till 2018 for Me Too to gain the kind of traction it has? And even despite Me Too, we have a situation where in November of 2018, 80% of cases are still not reported. Is the statute too confrontational? Is the statute itself setting up a structure that women are not comfortable with in terms of dealing with sexual harassment? And are there alternative structures that would give women the comfort to at least report the incidents? Or is the issue completely different? Is the issue cultural? So I'll throw that open to.
yeah, I mean,
Okay, so all of you.
Okay. I think it's a lot more socio-cultural. Yeah, the law exists, but the law is law. And how many people really know the law and go and read it? So it's really not about the law. And for a lot of organizations that I see as well, they tend to do education on the law. But that's not what's required. It's about culture building in the organization, and that's really the behaviors is what you need to focus on, right? So I think that's a very important thing. Having said that, women are still very hesitant. Okay, because there is the social stigma associated when a woman comes up and reports something. She's looked at, oh, you must have done something to deserve what happened. Yeah, maybe you were dressed in a certain way, maybe you smiled a little wider than you needed to. All of these questions get asked, and then the woman is saying, and I have personally seen in many companies where women have come up and said, I want to raise a complaint, and you tell them, do it. They say, no, I don't want to raise it as a formal complaint, but I'm telling you, please do what you can to help me. Right? Why aren't you raising it? Because I'm not going to get support. When I go back home, my husband or my in-laws or whoever else is going to say, there are so many women going to work. If this has happened to you, obviously you must have done something to deserve it. So they don't get the support that they need. So most times women don't raise it for that reason. Two, even if they do raise it, they're very, very worried about the retribution that could come, the retaliation. Not just in terms of the workplace, my boss may not give me the right job I need, or may not rate me well, or move me to another assignment that I don't really, that doesn't really fit me. It's also the fear of what's going to happen outside. If it's a manager, then you're fearing, work-related retribution. Otherwise, this, I'm safe in the organization because the organization gives me that comfort, but I also have to go to the mall, I need to go to the movies. What's to say that this guy is not going to attack me physically outside? What if somebody throws acid on my face? These are the fears that are stopping women from actually bringing up complaints. So it's building that culture where people, where you prevent. I think that's the key thing.
And that's layered on top of fears that men in organization have about reporting issues when they are confronted with a difficult boss. They don't want to confront the difficult boss because it'll affect their career path. We've all heard about career limiting moves that might be right but aren't taken up. So in addition to that, you've got the cultural dimension for women, and there is the gender aspect of it, which you can't ignore, which sort of coats everything else. But are you guys going to add to that?
I think Nirmala has said most of what I wanted to say, but I would give one example here to add to what you already said. I have come across a situation, not in our organization, but I have heard about a situation where a young engineer, a young engineer, 23, 24, 25-year-old with a very promising career, faced some such incidents. Went to the HR. HR took her to ICC, and she said, like you said, I don't want to report because I don't want this to go to my family. I don't want this thing to go to my family. And somehow this particular thing reached her family. She had to quit the job and she had to go back to her native place. I don't know what she is doing now, but she had a promising career. And probably the person who was stalking her doesn't know what are the consequences of his act. So it's more of a socio-cultural reason which actually stop women from doing it. There are so many such, there can be so many such examples which are real life examples.
In addition to what Nirmala and Sunita have told, what I feel personally is why you were asking about why Me Too now after so long. Okay, so it had taken a long time for the act after the first incidents had happened to come in, and after that it is, if you ask me, it's 5 years, and that would be the time which any industry or any organization would take to educate the people. So I would say that the awareness has increased a little bit, and the people have got confidence to speak, telling that, okay, I have the rights. That is why it has happened now. That is my personal take on that.
Shweta, it was your comment that provoked the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like Nirmala started by saying, and Sunita and Tapasya added, law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a socio-cultural context, which they've covered beautifully. And I think we all understand that we are just looking at the tip of the iceberg. We're just beginning to scratch the surface out here, and it is going to take a while before all the news debates actually turn into something more constructive, and I'm hoping that they would, and women will get more and more confidence to kind of approach formal institutions for redressal. And here's where I would want us all to be thinking in this room and probably beyond, that it is actually the job of the IC, which is empowered by the law to actually pass on the message and educate a complainant that whether it is on the confidentiality front, that the case details are not going to be discussed beyond the room in which they are seated, and it's not really going to, it's up to them if they want to discuss it with family and friends, but it's not really the IC or the organization that is really going to involve their family unless they themselves want their family to be involved. And in certain cases, that could very well be a logical step given the safety and security of the complainant. And also the zero retaliation, which the Act in a way hinges upon. That's the whole idea of having a formal mechanism, deeply empowered, dealing with these situations in the organization, where it makes it very clear that these are the things which are available to you the minute you come to me and complain. So whether it is not reporting into the same individual that you're currently reporting into and raising a complaint against during the pendency of the inquiry, or taking some time off, whether it is for you or asking the person who is in question to take some time off, and then as you get greater clarity as you proceed with the inquiry, to see what mechanisms as an organization are you going to put in place so that the woman who's coming to work and who has raised this issue feels safe and secure. So the safety and security of the complainant and the interim measures and the final measures, giving them a sense of security that nothing really is going to happen to them and there's not really going to be any retaliation against them, is actually the responsibility of the IC. And I keep going back to this, and probably I'll keep going back to this all along as we go ahead in this discussion too, that it's very cultural. So if you set the right tone from the top, that this is a zero tolerance to any instances of sexual harassment workplace, then it takes you a long way in encouraging your women to report issues relating to sexual harassment.
So just getting a rough consensus, am I right in assuming that the broad view is that the Act itself does provide flexibility, that the Act itself is actually a good statute? Me Too might help in promoting its use, but the organizations themselves need to work much harder in terms of understanding and learning what tools are available under the Act, whether it's confidentiality, whether it's the range of sanctions, whether it's the protection against retaliation. And my last question before we throw it open, and this is not just because Indu paid for the coffee, as Rahul mentioned. When it comes to helping organizations deal with that type of issue, what are the options available for organizations? Is technology an option available for organization? And Indu, you can pay me later for asking this question. But, or are those issues also best dealt with through internal systems and processes, or through cultural awareness, or a mix, possibly? Because very often, internal systems and processes breed cultures within organizations. So really, the broad question again for all four of you is, what next? How can the Act be improved in its implementation and use across organizations? Anyone?
I think awareness is something where we are all lacking, and we started with that. We are all, most of the organization are lacking behind. The awareness session are so standardized. One of a very sophisticated, mostly lawyer, comes and says certain things which many people don't understand. The housekeeping staff doesn't even understand English. So That, of course, I say the one size fits all is being done. Mostly. I won't say everyone is doing it, mostly. Though Tapasya said that there are trainings, but maybe everyone is not covered. Maybe everyone is covered. Even if everyone is covered, still, like the example I gave, people still don't understand that this is harassment. The women employees comes and says that I didn't know that this can fall under harassment. They don't know. So
it's really not about looking out for things and raising complaints. That should not be the intent. You know, it's not that we want more trouble. It's telling people that they need to be respectful. And I think that's the most basic thing. So what constitutes respect in the workplace? You know, and in this context, in terms of what is okay to be said and done in an organizational context is important. Because what may be acceptable socially may not be acceptable in an organizational context. I might greet everybody with a hug, and I do that to men and women, but I can't do that in an organization if I sense this is not going to be acceptable here. And this is where the culture piece comes in, because a handshake in a city is quite different from a handshake in a smaller town like Belgaum or Salem, because the women would be very, what do you say, uncomfortable with something like that. Now, it's the same company, there's a different culture. And this is to be kept in mind. So I don't see technology taking over the role of an IC. Even with 4 people sitting on the committee breaking their heads over, you know, what's right, what's wrong, is very, very difficult. And
But what about systems and processes?
systems and processes exist in terms of, you know, you need to send this in this time. It's kind of helping you do that and helping or asking organizations to stay within certain time limits in terms of resolving issues. But that whole process of understanding what exactly transpired, what could have happened, the circumstantial evidence, what was a reasonable thing, you know, to have happened in the circumstances that they're talking about. And you will find cases over and over again that are so difficult. I mean, since we're talking about cases, let me tell you a case that we are struggling with right now. This is an organization where the company is going on a picnic. They're all on a bus. They're going to Goa, okay? And there is a young girl who's an intern who's in the organization. She's also part of the group. And it's night, and she's got a blanket. The guy sitting next to her didn't have a blanket. And apparently it was cold, and she felt he was cold, so she offered her blanket to him, okay? And, well, something happened. And at one point, she got up from there, moved and sat somewhere else, and she didn't talk about it. She moved on. She was only an intern in the organization. She moved on. Now, with everything that's going on around the Me Too, she said, I felt emboldened. I wanted to bring this up. She writes to the company and says, this happened to me. This guy is still in your organization. What are you going to do about it? Now, we call the guy, and he could have very easily said, no, it didn't happen. But he said, yes, it did happen. I was 23. I come from a small town. This was the first time I was, you know, in a big city, and she was sitting next to me. She offered me her blanket. And at some point, she put her head on my shoulder, so I thought I had permission to do a little bit more than that, okay? I feel I've grown since then. She's moved on. I would have apologized to her if I had known, but, you know, she moved on, and I have not met her, but I remember the incident. It happened. I'm willing to apologize now. So when you talk to the girl, you know, you share the blanket. She says, that's it. That's what everybody says. By giving somebody a blanket to share, am I inviting this person to behave like this? Okay? So really brings in the question, you know, what is okay, what is not okay. And then, on top of all of this, if we were taking a decision at a different time, we might have looked at it very differently. Okay? So, you know, she's not an employee now, it's 4 years ago, and, you know, all of that, we would have taken a different decision. But at this point, the decision is going to be a harsh one. Partly also because this organization was already in the news on something else, and we don't want to be caught. You see what I'm saying? So how do you decide? It's just not fair, but all of this is collateral damage that happens. Simply because, you know, for a larger good, we have to let one head roll. So you're struggling with all of this, and I don't see technology taking over any of this. You will still have people sitting and breaking their heads over what's a fair decision. And it can always be contested both ways.
No, absolutely. But I think this goes back to what Latika was talking about in the earlier panel, which is that you use technology to support, not to replace. And there are issues that Shweta alluded to. Confidentiality. Just making people aware of their rights, about giving them assurances that there won't be retaliation. You know, this is a poor example, but every time a plane takes off, the pilot goes through a checklist, even though she might have flown that plane 1,000 times, and still has to make sure that every item on that checklist is met. Is that something that can be generated for ICCs? That however complex the case is, they still have to go through the checklist of making sure that the parties to the complaint are aware of the bare minimum standards that the ICC needs to look at your example of this lady who had to go home, because clearly her confidentiality was breached in that situation, right? And she should have had the security of knowing that if she made a complaint, oh, she informed her parents, okay. But in those circumstances, she might have thought twice about informing her parents if she were assured of the confidentiality of the process. So again, I mean, it's really about supplementing. I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left, and I'm sure there are questions from I can already see hands going up. If you could direct your question to a specific person, that would be great. Otherwise, I'm happy to do that for you. Two questions at the back. Do you want one of these mics?
Maybe you can just yell out your question.
Yeah. Do you want one of these mics?
Okay, so my question is directed actually towards the panel. I think at least from the discussion we saw, it's clear that it is the prerogative of the organization to set up an ICC and be able to implement what exists already. But how do we then hold institutions and enterprises account if they're not actually following what they are entitled or what they are supposed to do? And I think that may be a reason why Me Too has actually come to play, because we aren't seeing that organizations are upholding, these statutes. They aren't taking that initiative to even understand that, okay, if I have someone in my workplace who is well-known harasser, why am I not, taking it up with upper management, especially when upper management knows? So whether or not there is a formal ICC in place, how do we create a culture where when there is something going wrong, there is upper management involved immediately, regardless? And if they're not, how do we hold organizations as a whole accountable? Can there be larger bodies that can then take over? For example, we see the power NASSCOM has. What can NASSCOM do to be able to implement this on a larger industry level?
So,
The same question.
Same question.
Same question. Thank you to the panel for a very enlightening discussion, and I was very heartened to see so much positivity in all of you, in your faith in the law and in the human spirit, that you would believe that organizations actually would want this cultural change. This is particularly interesting because before coming here, I got a call from a construction company in Delhi, and the only question they wanted to know on this POSH was, what happens if they don't implement? What is the contravention? What is the consequences? Therefore, the trigger is, and when we say 50,000 for this first offense for a construction company, it's not a big deal. You double, second offense, it's 1 lakh, and maybe your license will go. Again, that's not very much for them. They can fix it. Therefore, in fact, when I was driving here, I was thinking of asking Manisha and Indranil that if I could have an answer to give them which affected their bottom line, to show that when you have training, when you have quality training, your level of prevention of instances, your productivity, all of that goes up. That is far more effective than having just the section to read out that it's a 50,000 rupee cost to the company not to implement it.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly what organizations are trying to do. At least the more evolved ones have realized this. A lot of people, you know, like your construction company, for example, will probably bring in somebody to talk for half an hour and say, okay, everybody is attended, a tick in the box, and they're out. So helping organizations to actually understand this is important is very, very relevant here. And I can tell you, I've been in this work for the last almost 10 years. And when we started initial work around this 10 years ago, people would come into the room thinking, hey, what are you going to tell me that I don't know? Okay? So they would sit there, and there was a lot of cynicism around it. And I see a completely different group of people walking in today. I want to know what this is. I want to make sure I'm safe. I'm seeing very senior leaders sitting through 2-3 hours of a discussion on this, and even saying, hey, what if something comes up in my organization, if a senior leader is named, how am I going to manage it? Do we need to have a crisis management plan and you know, readily available? So they're starting to think about that. And it took a Me Too for us to get there. Okay? So here was this window that opened up with one woman speaking up, and suddenly every woman is looking around saying, it's happened to me, it's happened to me. And should I bring it up? Now, there's also the other way to look at it. Now, why am I bringing it up? Because there are multiple things. Psychological trauma, am I looking for healing? Am I looking to pin somebody, nail somebody down and teach that person a lesson? You know, why am I bringing, all of them could have different motivations for it. Okay, so the people that I know who've brought it up, some of them have said, I brought it up because I wanted to have closure in my head. And it didn't go into social media or whatever. They've just called up their perpetrators and said, look, what you did to me was wrong, and this is how it impacted me. The person has said, sorry, whatever happened, and it's closed. Because for a lot of people, it's bringing that closure. For some people, it just might be, I need to pin this person down, this person has done this to several other people, let me do that. For still others, it could be, I want this to be a lesson for everyone else. So there are multiple reasons also why this is coming up after several years. Yeah, so, yeah.
But, sorry.
Did that answer?
I want to add one more point, going back to the first question that was asked on the enforceability piece of it. I think recently you've also seen the government take a lot of positive initiatives. So whether it is to actually make that statement mandatory in your board of directors report, to launching She-Box, which will then redirect you to the formal mechanism within your organization, they are already, what's good to see is that they are already thinking about ways in which you can increase the effectiveness of this particular legislation. And as society evolves, and as Nirmala was saying, more and more complaints come up, the awareness is bound to go up. And couple it with all these measures, you can hope for much better enforceability of the statute.
I had a question, actually, if I can take it back to what Mr. Munkur mentioned in the beginning about prevention. I think now the way we're looking at POSH, or the way we're looking at Me Too, it is very reactive. You know, it has been a name and shame movement, which has elicited a lot of publicity, a lot of awareness. But if we take it back to prevention, what are we actively doing to create safe working spaces for women, you know, that are not hostile to result in these kinds of incidents? And to add to that, I think we initially talked about how the Me Too movement kind of boxed, made it sort of a one-size-fits-all shame if you were either eve-teasing someone or, you know, going directly and physically harassing someone, that they were treated the same. But I think in the same light, if we look at that and also talk about that within training, that it is a spectrum of the way we treat people around us, that it can range from, you know, as simple as sending something inappropriate to being physically inappropriate. I think that has to be sort of laced in the way we communicate within our organizations, not just in trainings, you know? So what do you think we can do, and what steps do you think we can take to make sure it's preventative at large, you know?
One of the things that organizations need to start thinking about is that in today's day and age, diversity is not an option. It's not something that if you don't have, you will continue doing well in your business. You need a very diverse workforce, and to have a diverse workforce, you need to give them that safe and secure work environment. So it's as much the organizations need today to promote a very safe workplace which invites a diverse workforce, because it's the necessity of your business. There's no point having everybody who looks the same, speaks the same language, thinks the same way, contributing towards your business, because that's when your business starts stagnating. And that message needs to kind of percolate. And then not use your awareness campaigns and educational measures as checkbox items. You need to continue to evolve in that space and probably keep experimenting with newer and newer ways in which you can really reach out to great numbers amongst your workforce. You might not ever be able to, or at some point, be able to get to 100% of your workforce, but as long as you have drilled that message across a large majority of your people that certain behaviors are not okay, leveraging, and this takes me back to what Ramanand was asking earlier, leveraging perhaps technology. Maybe a 2-minute clip playing in your cafeteria which says that this is what the company stands for or has a formal mechanism in place. You can report it out, don't be scared, there's confidentiality, no retaliation. That continuous playing of that video clip might really play on people's minds. So there are a lot of ideas that as the company's IC you can really put to use, again, if you have the will to.
If I could just add to that, what I think we're witnessing now is a cultural shift, or at least signs of a cultural shift. And with any cultural shift, it won't take a linear path. And it won't travel at the same speed across different industries, across different organizations. But it will eventually get there. Whether it does eventually get there in 2 years or in 5 years might vary across sectors, across organizations, but I think the benefits of Me Too is in triggering that cultural shift to occur. Me Too probably won't control the way in which it occurs, but I mean, there's reason to be a little optimistic on that account at least. I think there are a couple more questions that we have time for. There was one out here. And
this is regarding this legislation. See, I think the legislation what we have today is not fixing the issue completely. There are different legislations which is fixed at different laws. For example, if you see, there is a dowry menace which was there prevalent, and ragging in educational institutions. Then there is a female foticide. Then there is a gender gap, and there was a news item that by 2050 gender gap will be almost half in India. So, and even the children are not spared in the current situation. So I think the POSH law has failed in addressing this in a complete system. It should take into account all this legislation and bring out one proper legislations to deal with this. This is my view. I thought I will check with the panel.
In any case, law is always the most basic minimum that you want. You know, as organizations, we need to be looking for a more evolved culture in our organizations beyond the law. Yeah.
So, this law is definition, or maybe they called as a prevention of sexual harassment. Its basics is a prevention. Actually, we are talking about most of the times we are talking about the after the events. The prevention, maybe the training, I think some people are talking about the training and all. The prevention in other way, also behavioral changes or the behavioral activities of both the person or the several person, the people management has to take care of if there is something is going wrong. The prevention that itself happens, and the brand or the company's reputation also is safeguarded. This here, the prevention word is most important. Like earlier, the Prevention of Food Adultery Act become a food safety. The food safety because it's some self-compliance. So the prevention of the food adulteration is a prevention there. So here, it will be prevention only. If once it prevents, then everything is okay. The second question is any organization is having, the small organization having the 1 or 2 ladies and 10 gents. So on that case, who's the committee member? How is committees works?
So if your first question was around
Prevention.
prevention. Yes, prevention is the right way to go. It's the best way to deal with this, but it's not as simple, right? Now, when most organizations tend to kind of, like I said, do this tick in the box. Now, to have somebody constantly reminding people of incidents that are typically happening around the organization, taking those instances and saying, hey, this is what we did with somebody who did this, and our organization will not tolerate this, is very important. You're actually bringing in examples, because the obvious kinds of harassment like molestation or a rape or whatever very rarely happens in the workplace. What constitutes sexual harassment in the workplace are a lot of these jokes, or a friendly pat that went awry, or office romance that sort of went wrong. So these are the things that it all starts off very nicely. And you also have a very diverse group of people in organizations today. You have people that are coming from smaller towns, etc. So there's a very wide difference in values of how we must deal with people. So the people that are coming from smaller towns also want to be like the cool city people, and want to do things that they are not comfortable yet with, but they think they should, because that's how I will get promoted, that's how I'll be seen as somebody in the organization. There are all these things that are playing out. So helping to, telling people, please, this is important, do not push people to do things that they don't want to do. It could be pulling somebody onto a dance floor, pushing somebody to have a drink when they don't want to. These are all things that you do in a very friendly way, or you think it is friendly. But when the person says, no, I don't want it, but you're saying, hey, come on, yeah, we can't get you Bonvita now, please have a scotch. It's friendly, it's fun, and many times all of this is also masked as fun. So how do we tell people all of this is not okay? And you have to call out as many instances like this, because these are what typically tends to happen.
No, that's what my question, the prevention is a cocktail party. Why can't you prevent?
Why can't you prevent a cocktail party?
Yes, in such a case, if your
Why
company is losing in their name in that
event. We will have to
event.
segregate our men and women. And
No, I'm just giving the example.
No. Everything should happen, but it should happen in very respectful ways.
Yes.
We can all drink together, not a problem. But if I say I don't want any more, you don't need to push me. Okay? And if it's my boss who's pushing me, or an influential person in the team that's pushing me to have another drink when I don't want to, I'm sort of forced to go along with it. Right? Because I don't want to be made fun of, or whatever. We all want to fit in. So we need to understand the human psychology around this. And oftentimes it's the power. It's your power that makes you think you can get away with some behaviors. So calling them out individually, giving as many instances of everyday happenings. Right? So that would help the education. And it's like the government's pulse polio program. I always like to refer it. Every 6 months, 2 drops. Over a period of time, it will come to a halt. And like Shweta was pointing out, organizations have started to do the messaging over different channels. They're using theater, they're using song and rhythm and music to convey a message, all in small doses, but bringing up relevant situations that happen in the workplace. So that's the way they connect. Otherwise, talking to them about the law makes no difference to any of them. Yeah?
The second question
was on the small organizations with nine men and 2 women. We recently had a situation like that, where we had a small organization with 7 men and 2 women, and the 2 women were, one was the office receptionist and the other was the cleaning lady, and both of them were the complainants in that situation. And look, the Act doesn't say you only need you can only have 1 external member. It says you need at least 1 external member. And in a situation like that, what we recommended to the organization, I think, is an easy fix, is you just make sure you have more external members, and so you have a majority of women on the panel.
Yes, I agree that you can appoint as much of the external members. For small organization, either instead of making business, he has to make investment.
Sorry?
for the external agencies.
So that's exactly what we
That
need
is
to
coming
drive.
out in the near future, like or any cost.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that is what we are all trying to drive, is the cultural shift. It's not an either or situation out here, that if you have an internal committee, if you start addressing issues of sexual harassment at the workplace, you're going to go out of business or stop making money. That's not what we're hoping to achieve. What we are instead trying to say is that this is a very essential part of your existence. And this goes to developing a certain set of core values, and not just for an individual organization, but as society evolves, right? That's what we are aiming at.
No, definitely, that's why I pressurized the prevention word. That
Everybody
gives.
agrees on the prevention.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any debate.
And I think the view, at least out that I see a consensus on, is that prevention will occur over time, and the process towards actual prevention has begun, and we're starting to see that. That doesn't mean, you know, the moment a law is enacted, it becomes effective immediately. If you remember, we used to have a law called Coffee Posa, which was a draconian law. It resulted in an increase in the amount of offshore funds and black money that was stashed away. The law doesn't necessarily have the trigger, but I think the overall view, at least on this law, is it creates the framework, and the Me Too movement has at least lit an ember or some sort of fire to help that engine develop. So, you know, with that, I think we should call this panel to a conclusion, and thank you, panelists, thank you, audience, and Lexplosion for having us here.
Thank you very much, panelists. I request you to be on stage, and also request Indranil to please come.
This is the best we could get for you, so. And if I try to prove the one thing, this is what you get for me. Thank you, Devana. Thank you so much. It was very, very good. So, with that, we conclude this part of the event, which was listening to real luminaries and people who practice in this area on matters which impact all of us on a daily basis. So thank you, everybody, all the people who found their way to this evening, and of course to all the panelists, to Sachin for such a wonderful keynote and for setting the tone for the day. The bar is open. I hope that all of you can join us now. With your permission, sir, from I hope it's all right.